Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I'm Z, aka The Reluctant Accountant. Let's get into it. Okay, so in episode 3, I spoke a little bit about my obsession with cults and also about the cult/wellness intersection. And I feel like I need to elaborate, mostly because some of you have contacted me and been like, what's going on? Are you trying to start a cult? And I know you guys want to sign up, but not just yet. You know, everything in its time. And I don't think this is the right time for me. But, you know, hold tight. You never know what's going to happen. So I think if I'm going to explain, apart from obviously my own almost recruitment into a cult, I need to explain about the first cult story that I ever heard. And I think it's an interesting one because it's one that many people kind of know about, they've heard about, but they don't really know the full story. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that story and why actually, like many cults, it's a tragedy. But I think in this particular case, there are things that are missed out of the narrative that are really, really important. So if I was to say the name Jim Jones to some of you, I think some of you will be like, Dipset, Cameron, how do you know? Okay, stop. That is not where we're going with this. But some of you may remember where that name comes from. You may remember that he is the cult leader who founded Jonestown and is responsible for the death of hundreds of people. So that's where I want to start, with Jim Jones, with Jonestown, and really kind of maybe explore a side of it that you may not have heard of. So to begin with, I think a good place to start would be to talk about a phrase that many people have heard of, and I think that a lot of people don't necessarily associate with Jim Jones or the cult, and that is don't drink the Kool-Aid. Now, you've probably heard this before. You may even have used it like, oh my God, they drank the Kool-Aid, or don't drink the Kool-Aid. But not a lot of people know that that has very dark origins, and actually it comes from the Jonestown Massacre and is related to Jim Jones and his cult. I mean, if you have used that phrase, I want you to think about, like, would you have used it so freely, or were you aware that it refers to an event in which over 900 people died and over a third of those were children? And to be honest, the phrase isn't even accurate, but we'll get to that another time. And the reason I wanted to start or just kind of focus on this one, as I said, it was one of the first like cult stories that I'd heard about, but also I feel it's a story, as I mentioned, that people think that they know about, but they don't necessarily know the details. So the kind of headlines are, there's this guy called Jim Jones, he starts a cult, he decides to create his own community in Guyana in South America, called it Jonestown. People go there, they follow him, and then unfortunately, there's this kind of mass suicide event. And that is the story that we know, right? But that is part of the story. To be honest, that's just a version of the story, the most popularized version that we hear of this story, because it kind of trivializes it in a way. And it also allows us to kind of lay the blame for what happened at the feet of the victims of this tragedy. And in doing so, it very much ignores the context in which the tragedy occurred. And so this is what I wanted to do in today's episode, is to offer some context about Jim Jones, about how he managed to convince almost 1,000 people to leave everything they knew in America, travel to some jungle in South America, in the hope of setting up a new life. So Jim Jones was born in 1931 in rural Indiana. He opened his church, the People's Temple, in the mid-1950s. Okay, nothing too remarkable about that. It's a church, it's America, but there is something different. There's something that we're really forgetting here. 1950s America is a very divided America. There is heightened racial violence. It's just 100 years since the abolition of slavery, and Black people are living under the real threat of violence, okay? There is segregation, there is a ongoing civil rights movement. People are still being lynched. And so contextually, opening a church in this environment is not the same as opening a church today. So enter Jim Jones, okay? He comes in and he's charismatic. He speaks in this cadence that Black people are familiar with from their own churches.
Rise on new foundations. We have been not. We shall be
And he's preaching things that they want to hear. He's preaching a message of safety for them. He's preaching a message of racial equality. He's preaching unity. And don't get me wrong, it's not just talk. He's not just out here talking the talk. He's actually walking the walk. So he talks about this racial unity, right? And you're thinking, yeah, okay. But he also, at the time, adopted 3 Korean children. He adopted a child that was part Native American, and he also adopted a black child. In addition to that, the People's Temple ran programs for the needy. They did drug rehabilitation programs. They had legal aid services. And so he preached this message of social equality that really resonated with people that were essentially under attack from their own country. They were not wanted everywhere else, but in that place, in the People's Temple, they found a home. So with that context, of course it would be something that was attractive to Black Americans. I want you to think about this really carefully. You're in a society that doesn't value you, a society where you're seeing your peers on a daily basis being lynched, being brutalized, being discriminated against. And you have this man coming along and he's preaching racial harmony. He's preaching and he's doing things that would attest to the fact that he believes in what he says. Why would you not believe him under these circumstances? You don't have evidence to the contrary. And so in doing that, Jim Jones was able to offer Black people, Black Americans, and those who also believed in the ideals of social and racial equality, something different, something that the country wasn't offering them. Hope, protection, and a sense of belonging. And I think sometimes when we hear about these stories, we kind of look back and we're like, we've got the benefit of hindsight. And we look back very much with modern eyes, looking back at a time that we really can't relate to. And I think it's very easy just to say, these people are just naive. They're just kind of, fanatics looking for this charismatic person to believe in. But we see these things happening now. Like we sometimes talk quite disparagingly about the kind of olden days, but we see this kind of fanaticism happening now without even the actions to follow it. Well, if you look at Trump fans, I'm sorry, but Trump will stand up and lie in front of his fans' faces. He will stand up and tell them his suit is red when it is blue, and they will still clap for him. And I say, so at the very least, at least Jim Jones, as I said, was walking his walk. He was walking his talk. He was out there and he was putting forward those programs and he was doing things in the community and he was helping people with the housing. Trump is just out there talking about the size of crowds and inciting nefarious behavior. And in addition to this, the People's Temple forged strategic relationships with the Nation of Islam, with the Black Panthers, and with other progressive Black churches. In counterculture San Francisco, they organized around affirmative action, affordable housing, police brutality, and many other very much progressive initiatives. It was essentially an activist church. And Jones also very much loved to declare his Blackness, right? Even though he was playing this role of white savior. And actually, the temple's kind of pro-Black politics masked what was inherently a white power structure in the inside. It comprised of a lot of just, young white women who, as is normal for cult leaders, Jim Jones had various relationships with. So this was all, again, the backdrop I want you to consider what happened under, 1950s America, the segregation, the violence, all of this stuff. And I say that because a large proportion, the majority of the church was Black, okay? The majority of the people that followed Jim Jones were Black Americans. And so this is all going on and the church is going for, a couple of decades, and into the 70s, things get a bit touchy, things get a bit hairy, and the tide starts to turn. Whilst, initially there were all these kind of political progressives especially and other people that were forming alliances, the media kind of turned on him. And again, at this point, you may be thinking, well, if people are turning on him, if people are trying to expose him, why aren't his followers listening? But again, is that what really happens? If you think, we can put Trump aside because we know his fans are never going to turn on him. But if you think about, for example, just celebrities, a famous singer, and the amount of things that person can do, they don't even know. This is somebody that's probably not even met the fan that adores them. And they will do things and it will come out that they've been accused of this or they've done this. And it could even be proven. And people stick, that's my man and I'm going to stick beside him. But that's literally what it is, right? And so I want you to, again, suspend your kind of modern belief and think back to the 50s or think back to the 60s, you've got this backdrop of segregation, the civil rights movement is kind of petering out, you've still got discrimination, people are still being brutalized, and then all of a sudden, the media's turning on the person that's helped you. This is, who are you going to believe, the media or the guy that helped you get off drugs? The media or the person that helped you get housing? The media or the person that was out there doing what he said he was going to do? And maybe, he's accused of an affair or he's accused of this, but nobody's perfect, right? And he's been there for you. He's helped you out. So it's against this backdrop that in 1977, Jim Jones goes to Guyana and he encourages his flock to come with him. And he's like, look, let's go down there. We'll build the utopia. America's rotten. We need to leave. And so people do leave. Hundreds and hundreds of people leave and they get down there and they get to Jonestown. Jonestown is in Guyana. It's in the middle of the Guyanese jungle. And I say that not because the whole of Guyana is a jungle, but where they went, honey, was not like just an abandoned town. Okay. And also I want you to remember this is in the 70s. So these stories of Jim Jones, they often focus on him as this authoritarian figure, saying, that he was charismatic, but he's controlling, he's promiscuous, he's manipulative. And I'm not going to argue that he's any of those things because he probably was all of those things. I mean, people that don't even make it to the heights of cult leader and they can be all of those things. So I'm sure he was. But again, we need to kind of cast our minds back to the middle of the 70s. You've gone down there and you followed this guy that you really believed in. You really kind of hoped that this would be something new for you because you've been living under conditions that were unsustainable in the United States. And you get down to this place that's essentially a jungle. Okay, you get down there and there is no infrastructure. It's very primitive. And if you want that utopia, you know what you've got to do? You've got to build it yourself. You've got to build it. And at this point, again, many of you are thinking, well, I just go back. How are you getting back? There is no infrastructure. They don't have phones. You can't just call so-and-so and say, look, can you come and get me? There are no, there's no internet. They've barely got roads in the place where they are. Okay, so you get down there and it's something you believe in and you probably wouldn't just leave. You probably would try to make it work. And that's what people tried to do. They tried to make it work while they were down there. And again, this kind of idea like, oh, you could just leave or you could just do this. I want you to think about this. Not a few years ago, there were very rich people stuck on an island, very, very rich people, because they believed that they were going to be attending a fire festival. Sorry, Sorry, I'm not laughing at the rich young children, but they believed they were going to be attending a fire festival. And if those rich kids and those influencers could not get off the island in the 21st century, then I'm not sure what you expected of people that had literally sold all of their possessions to get down to Jonestown, Guyana in the middle of the jungle and how they were supposed to escape. This isn't, I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. You kind of have to try and make it work. And that's what they did. But unfortunately, it didn't really work out. By all accounts, Jim Jones' behavior seemed to get kind of worse and he was becoming more and more paranoid. And that's kind of what tends to happen if you, I'm saying kind of tends to what happened. I'm just assuming everyone has this fascination with cults as that I do. But this is something that you'll find that happens. He becomes more isolationist. It becomes more us and them. And that's a really big part of cults is to kind of force the group or make the group stay together. We don't want them kind of mixing with the outside world because the house of cards will fall if that happens. And so this is what happens. People get down there and they come with these big dreams of this utopia, and what they're met with essentially by many accounts of people that survived is a racially segregated prison camp. And what do I mean by that? So remember I said to you that the majority of the people that had followed Jim Jones or that were kind of part of this People's Temple Church were black people. They weren't exclusively. Again, because he was preaching racial equality and social equality, there was a mix of people, but it was predominantly black people. So what you found down in Jonestown was that the division of labor wasn't equal. Okay, what you would find is that the administrative jobs, i.e. the jobs that were outside of the, manual labor or were not under the hot sun of the South American sun, they were given to white people. They were given to, the young white women that Jim Jones was having relations with. And the hard, laborious jobs that took place under the sun that went from sun up to sundown, they were predominantly filled by black people. You could always argue, for example, that there were more black people. So there were more black people, and there's probably going to be more labor jobs, so that makes sense. But no, it was almost exclusively that the administrative jobs were given to the minority white people. And so what you had essentially was a replication of this kind of white power, a hierarchical structure that they just left. And so there is a point, I think, and again, I wasn't successfully recruited into a cult, so I can't speak from experience. But I think there's a point where people start to realize that this isn't the dream, right? The veil starts to slip, and people start to realize that this isn't really what they signed up for. This isn't really something that they want to be in. And there was, again, according to accounts from people that survived Jonestown, and some people did survive, there were accounts from them which suggested that, people started to kind of be disgruntled and they really didn't want to be there. But there was no big uprising. Okay. One of the things about cults is that behavior is very much discouraged. And also there becomes a paranoia between the members of a cult, is that you can't necessarily speak to someone because you don't know if they're going to turn you in. And so that culture was very prevalent. But anyway, that's in 1977, but then by 1978, some of the family members and relatives of those people that had gone down to Jonestown were becoming increasingly worried. They had said that they feel that their family members are being held there against their will, and they wanted the US government to step in. And finally, after, a lot of campaigning and haranguing and, writing letters to get people to do something, Congressman Leo Ryan decides that he's going to try and get invited down, and so that he can see what's going on. So by all accounts, Leo Ryan was like a maverick congressman. He'd, done random things before. I think one time he'd got sent to a prison just to kind of see what it's like in prison. So he was that guy that did that. He was, I wouldn't say it was like a performative person, but he definitely was someone that really wanted to be out there and do things in politics. And so he asks Jim Jones that if he can visit Jonestown. And eventually Jim Jones says yes. Not really sure why Jim Jones said yes at that point, but he does. And so Leo Ryan flies down to Guyana along with journalists and some relatives of family members that are in Jonestown. And so they go down there, and if you want to, you can actually look up some of the footage from the time that he does this visit, because some of the footage has been released. And so by all accounts, it seems to be going well. Like, people seem really happy. They're doing the kind of interviews. The journalists are doing interviews. And Leo Ryan at one point is looking around. And he's like, yeah, people seem happy. Everything seems good over here. And there's all this, and looking back again, when you look with kind of fresh eyes and the benefit of hindsight, you can see that it kind of looks like when an official comes to a school, to a primary school or secondary school or whatever. They come to a school and the teacher has picked all the good students to make sure those are the ones that greet the official that comes out, and everybody's got, prepared a song that they're going to do, and everyone's smiling. They've been practicing for ages. You better smile. That's kind of the vibe that it was giving. The difference is, obviously, this wasn't a school. This is the middle of the jungle. And so everything's going really, really well until at some point, one of the entourage for Leo Ryan is given a note. And the note says something to the effect of, we're being held here against our will. We're not allowed to leave. Please let us come with you. And so Leo Ryan's entourage, his team, bring that to the attention of Jim Jones. And Jim Jones, as you can imagine, is livid. And he's livid, and he does the thing that we think he's going to do. And he kind of, feels like this is a betrayal, and it has this big speech. And then he says, look, if you want to go, you can go. And so some people do go. But again, when you're under the threat of somebody, this big, charismatic, authoritarian figure, and they say, if you want to go, you can go, to you and I on the outside, we'll be like, cool, well then I'm just going to go. I'm just going to leave. But on the inside, there is that fear of repercussion. That is the fear of, is he really going to do this? And so the majority of people obviously do not just leave. So a small entourage goes along, and it's quite small, that goes along with Leo Ryan, and they go to leave Jonestown and they go to leave Guyana. And they are waiting on the airstrip. And as they're waiting on the airstrip, a truck comes round with members of the People's Temple, and it opens fire on all of the people at the airstrip. And when they do that, 4 people die, and one of those people is the congressman. Leo Ryan, the congressman, the maverick congressman, who's traveled down from the US to Jonestown, has been killed. essentially murdered by the members of this cult. And so obviously word gets back to the camp that the people didn't make it off the airstrip. And Jim Jones knows that this is like his final showdown, right? He knows that this is the end of the road. You don't really come back from just killing a US politician. And so he gathers everybody around and he says to them, like, this is the time. This is what they're going to do. They're going to send in the Guyanese military and they're going to take your babies away and they're going to crush us. And we have to take this final stand. And so he gathers everyone around and he laces a fruit punch with cyanide and the members drink it. And so that's the story that we're told, right? Because it seems like they're also aghast because they're so scared the US military or whoever it is going to come in and they're going to destroy everything these people were worked for. And these people who are just loyal followers of their supreme being, i.e. Jim Jones, they're so scared that they willingly take this drink laced with poison so that they can die rather than being saved or rather than reintegrating with society. But does that make sense to you? Because just to have 900 odd people just drinking poison willingly, I mean, even when people attempt to take their own lives, there is a fear that comes with that. Just willingly getting these 900 people to do that. And so what if I told you that the members were aware that the congressman had just been shot. And now, while they're being told that they must drink this juice to show their loyalty, they are surrounded by armed men with guns who are saying you can voluntarily show your loyalty as they stand there with guns in their hands. These people have just shot a congressman. What do you think they'd do to you for disobedience? What if I told you that long before this event, Jim Jones had actually done something similar and he'd had his followers drink what they believed was poison as a test of loyalty to him in a classic manipulation tactic? And what if I told you that some of the bodies were actually found with marks on them, suggesting that the poison had been injected into them rather than them having had drunk it? And what if I told you that over 300 of the 900 odd people that died at that event were children? And so we can't possibly suggest that these over 300 children would have known what they were doing and voluntarily elected to take their own lives. And so this event that's often referred to as this huge mass suicide would probably be more accurately described as mass murder. And in a lot of cases now, when you go and read up about it, they will call it a mass murder suicide. But I definitely don't think you can look at that event objectively and just say, yeah, these people just willingly walked into this just because they believed in this guy, Jim Jones. And before I kind of wrap up this story, I want to leave you with a few points. So 50% of the people that died were black women, and 75% or over 75% of the members of the church were black. Think about that when you hear stories about this event and the way that they're told and the callousness and kind of trivial manner in which the story is dealt with. And prior to the September 11th attacks, the tragedy in Jonestown was the biggest mass loss of US civilian life in history due to a non-natural disaster. And so think about that. Would you expect the language and the discourse about the September 11th attacks to be as equally kind of glib and trivial as you sometimes hear the discourse around this? And the final thing, if you're going to use the phrase, despite all of this, about don't drink the Kool-Aid, I just want you to know that it wasn't actually even Kool-Aid that they drank. It was Flavor Aid. So at least get that right. Well, that is all I have time for in today's episode. Thank you for joining me once again. It's been a pleasure, a privilege and a pleasure, I'll say. If you would like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email. The email address is themisinformationpodcast, that's miss with 2 S's, @gmail.com. That's the Misinformation Podcast @gmail.com. And I'm also on social media at The Reluctant Accountant. That's The Reluctant Accountant. The handle is the same on TikTok and on Instagram. But until next week, I'll see you in the Zeitgeist. Ciao.